I've spent 30 years covering fights in 17 countries. I've seen blood spilled on canvas in Manila, watched bones break in Bangkok, and witnessed men carried unconscious from arenas in Sao Paulo. I thought I understood violence. I thought I knew what happened when two fighters stepped into a ring with bad intentions. I was wrong. What I witnessed that night in Oakland wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a match. It was something older, something primal that doesn't belong in a world with referees and rules and medical staff standing by. It was the kind of raw, ancient confrontation that makes you realize civilization is just a thin coat of paint over something much darker. The date was September 23, 1967. The venue was a mid-sized arena in Oakland, California, not one of those glittering Las Vegas spectacles, but working-class territory. Concrete floors, metal folding chairs, and the kind of atmosphere where serious people came to watch serious fighting. The setup that changed everything. The crowd that night was unusual for 1967, mixed in a way that rarely happened back then. Chinese families sat alongside white dock workers. Black students from UC Berkeley filled an entire section near the back. Word had spread through underground networks, whispered conversations in gyms and training halls across the Bay Area. Everyone had heard the rumors about Bruce Lee. Not famous yet, not the global icon he would become, but known in certain circles. The martial arts community spoke his name with a particular kind of respect. The way boxers talked about Sugar Ray Robinson or musicians discussed Charlie Parker. I'd seen Bruce demonstrate once, 2 years earlier at a tournament in Long Beach. What struck me then wasn't just the speed, though that was remarkable, it was the precision. Every movement had purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. He moved like someone who understood that fighting wasn't performance art. It was problem solving with your body. But demonstrations are one thing. A ring is another entirely. His opponent that night was Tommy Stevenson, a professional boxer from Sacramento with a record that demanded respect: 18 wins, 3 losses, 14 by knockout at 6'2" and 210 pounds of solid muscle. Stevenson had the kind of build that made photographers happy and opponents nervous. He'd been working his way up the rankings, earning a reputation for heavy hands and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can end a fight with a single clean shot. The promotional material framed it as East meets West, that kind of lazy cultural shorthand that sold tickets in those days. What the promoters didn't advertise was Stevenson's very public opinions about martial arts. He'd been vocal, aggressively vocal, about his belief that all the Kataran forms and philosophical discussions were just elaborate dancing. Real fighting happens with fists, Western style, he'd told the Sacramento Bee 3 weeks earlier. Everything else is for movies. Some of his other quotes had made it into local papers, each one carrying an edge that went beyond simple athletic rivalry. There was contempt in them, the kind that makes you wonder what's really being said beneath the surface. The moment that ignited everything, I arrived 3 hours before the main event. The arena was already filling, that electric pre-fight energy crackling through the air. I found my spot ringside, close enough to hear the impact of leather on skin, close enough to see the micro expressions that television cameras miss. The undercard fights were competent but forgettable. Local kids trading shots, a middleweight bout that went to decision, the usual rhythm of these events. But the crowd was distracted, restless. Everyone was waiting for the main event. When Bruce Lee made his entrance, the temperature in the room shifted. He wore simple black pants and a fitted black top, no robe, no elaborate entrance music, no showmanship. He walked to the ring like a man walking to work. His face was composed but alert, eyes constantly scanning, always reading his environment. Stevenson's entrance was everything Bruce's wasn't. Music, lights, a silk robe with his name embroidered on the back. He played to the crowd, raising his gloved fists, grinning that confident boxer's grin. When he climbed through the ropes, he took his time, making sure everyone got a good look at the size difference. He had 4 inches and nearly 80 pounds on Lee, and he wanted everyone to notice. As both fighters settled into their corners, I noticed something that would later prove significant. Near Bruce's corner, someone had placed a small Chinese flag on the canvas, just inside the ring boundary. It was folded neatly, maybe 12 inches across, a modest gesture of cultural pride in a setting where such displays were rare. The referee called both men to the center for final instructions. Standard procedure: touch gloves, return to corners, wait for the bell. I'd witnessed this ritual 1,000 times in venues across the globe. But as they stood there listening to the referee's instructions about low blows and back of the head shots, Tommy Stevenson's eyes weren't on the official. They were scanning the crowd, still performing, still basking in the size advantage that had intimidated so many previous opponents. Then it happened. As Stevenson turned to return to his corner, he pivoted slightly. His right foot came down deliberately on the folded Chinese flag. Not a stumble. Not an accident. He looked down as he did it, then looked directly at Bruce Lee with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. The arena went quiet in a way I'd never experienced before or since. Not the quiet of anticipation, the quiet of collective shock. 2,000 people simultaneously realizing they'd just witnessed something beyond mere athletic rivalry. Even the loudest drunks in the cheap seats fell silent. The transformation I was watching Bruce Lee's face when it happened, and I've thought about that moment 10,000 times since. I've tried to describe it to colleagues, to students, to other journalists who cover combat sports. I always fail. Words weren't built for what I witnessed. His expression didn't change in any conventional way. There was no anger flash, no grimace, no visible clenching of jaw muscles. Instead, something went still. Deeply, profoundly still. His eyes, which had been alert and measuring, became something else entirely fixed, absolute. Like a switch had been thrown somewhere behind them and a different operating system had come online. I'd heard the phrase before in translated martial arts texts, in conversations with old masters who'd seen combat in China, Japan, and Korea. Killing intent, satsui in Japanese. The presence of the will to end a life, made manifest in the body and readable to anyone with eyes to see. I'd always thought it was metaphorical, poetic exaggeration designed to make ancient fighting arts seem more mystical than they actually were. It wasn't metaphorical. The referee was still talking, still going through his standard pre-fight speech about protecting yourself at all times, but nobody was listening. The entire arena had shifted into a different frequency. Stevenson had returned to his corner, his grin wider now, feeding off what he perceived as a successful psychological gambit. His trainer was probably telling him to forget the theatrics and focus on the technical aspects of the fight ahead. Bruce Lee hadn't moved. He stood in the center of the ring, exactly where the referee had left him, staring at the spot where the flag lay crumpled under the impression of Stevenson's boot print. The referee touched his shoulder, trying to guide him back to his corner. Lee didn't respond immediately. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, he was completely unreachable, locked inside whatever calculation or reckoning was taking place in his mind. When he finally moved, it was with the same controlled precision as before. He walked to his corner. He let his trainer check his gloves and mouthpiece. He rolled his shoulders once, twice. But the stillness was still there underneath everything, coiled and patient. I looked around the arena. The crowd had started murmuring again, but it was different now, nervous energy, people shifting in their seats, leaning toward their neighbors with whispered questions that had no good answers. The fight hadn't even started, yet the entire atmosphere had taken on a quality that none of us could properly identify. The bell the ring announcer was doing his job with professional enthusiasm, booming voice echoing through the space as he introduced both fighters, listed their records, and built artificial drama for the paying customers. But the real drama was already happening in the silence between his words, in the space between two men who were about to collide for reasons that had transcended sport entirely. I checked my tape recorder one final time. It was running. I had no idea what I was about to witness, but I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to capture every second of it. The timekeeper raised his hammer. The crowd held its breath. Bruce Lee was staring across the ring at Tommy Stevenson with eyes that had stopped being entirely human. The bell rang with a sound that seemed too thin for what it was supposed to signify. In a normal fight, that bronze note releases tension, triggers movement, starts the careful dance of testing and measuring that experienced fighters do in opening rounds. This wasn't a normal fight. Bruce Lee came out of his corner with a speed that made the ring girl flinch as she was still making her way toward the exit. Not rushing, not wild with rage, but moving with such immediate, focused purpose that the 20 feet between him and Stevenson seemed to collapse before Stevenson had fully raised his guard. I'd covered fights involving Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali in his prime, men who could make opponents miss and then make them pay with supernatural timing. This was different. Lee crossed that ring like he was simply deciding to exist in a different location and his body was obeying instantly, without the usual mechanical delays that govern normal human movement. Stevenson got his hands up just in time, boxer's instincts, elbows tucked, gloves protecting his face and chin. Lee didn't throw a punch. He stopped just outside Stevenson's striking range, completely still again, that same terrible stillness from the center ring moment. His eyes moved across Stevenson's body like he was taking inventory of vulnerable points, cataloging them, prioritizing them for future reference. It was the look a surgeon might give a patient while planning an operation, clinical and absolutely focused. Stevenson threw a jab, a good one, technically sound, the kind that had probably scored points in dozens of previous fights. Lee's head wasn't there when the glove arrived. He'd moved maybe 3 inches, a micro adjustment so economical it barely registered as movement. No wasted motion, no dramatic weaving, just absolute efficiency. Stevenson jabbed again, then followed with a right cross, putting real weight into it this time. Lee slipped both punches with that same minimal displacement, his feet barely shifting position. And then I noticed something that made me stop writing mid-sentence in my notebook. Lee's hands were at his sides. Not up in a traditional guard, not chambered for strikes, just hanging loose and relaxed. He was giving Stevenson a completely unprotected target, and somehow Stevenson couldn't hit it. The crowd was making noise now, but it was confused noise, uncertain energy. People didn't know how to interpret what they were seeing. By conventional scoring, Stevenson should have been winning. He was the aggressor, throwing punches, moving forward, controlling the pace. But everyone in that arena could sense that something was fundamentally wrong with that interpretation. The systematic breakdown: Stevenson threw a combination, 3 punches in rapid sequence, and for the first time, he connected. A glancing shot to Lee's shoulder that should have been meaningless, barely more than a touch. But Stevenson's entire facial expression changed the moment his glove made contact. I was close enough to see the recognition in his eyes, the sudden fear. It was like hitting a steel post wrapped in skin. No give, no absorption of impact, just density. Unnatural, unsettling density. Lee still hadn't thrown a strike. 30 seconds had passed, maybe 40. In boxing, in any combat sport I'd covered, this would be the moment where commentators would question the fighter's strategy, wonder why he wasn't engaging. But Lee was engaging, just not in any way the sport traditionally recognized. He was breaking Stevenson down psychologically, one missed punch at a time. Every attack that hit nothing but air, every moment Lee stood there with that fixed stare and those open hands, it accumulated. Pressure, doubt, the creeping realization that nothing Stevenson had trained for was going to work tonight. Stevenson backed up for the first time, just a small step, creating distance, trying to reset. Lee followed, matching the distance exactly, maintaining the same gap with mathematical precision. When Stevenson circled left, Lee mirrored him perfectly. When Stevenson feinted a jab, Lee didn't react to the feint at all. He only moved when the real punch came, which meant he was reading Stevenson's intentions before they manifested as physical action. I'd interviewed enough fighters over the years to recognize what was happening in Stevenson's head right then. He was frantically recalculating everything: his preparation, his confidence in his size advantage, his professional record, his understanding of his own capabilities. All of it was being systematically dismantled by a man who hadn't even hit him yet. The first round was 3 minutes long, but we were barely 60 seconds in when I saw Stevenson's corner exploding with activity. His trainer was screaming instructions, wild gestures, pointing at Lee, pointing at Stevenson's gloves. The message was unmistakable: stop dancing around and hit him. Stevenson tried. He really tried. He planted his feet and threw an overhand right with everything he had, the kind of punch that ends fights in highlight reels, the kind that had put 14 previous opponents to sleep. Lee moved inside it so close to Stevenson that the punch passed over his shoulder harmlessly. For half a second they were face to face, inches apart. I heard what Lee said because I was positioned directly ringside. 3 words, spoken quietly enough that maybe only Stevenson and I could hear them. You chose this. Then Lee was gone, back to his preferred distance, hands still down, still watching with those fixed, unblinking eyes. Stevenson threw everything after that. Hooks, uppercuts, combinations powered by growing desperation and panic. The crowd was roaring now, sensing blood even though no blood had been drawn. Lee made Stevenson miss every significant shot. A few glancing blows landed, just enough that the referee wouldn't stop it for lack of engagement. But nothing that mattered, nothing that affected his composure or positioning. 5 seconds that changed everything. With maybe 30 seconds left in the first round, Lee stopped moving away from punches. Stevenson threw a jab, the same jab he'd been throwing all night, fast and clean and technically correct. Instead of slipping it, Lee stepped into it, accepting the punch on his forearm, and in the same fluid motion, his right hand came up. Not fast in the way people typically think of speed, not a blur, not superhuman velocity, but inevitable, precise, unstoppable. His palm strike hit Stevenson square in the sternum. The sound was wrong. Flesh hitting flesh shouldn't make that noise. It was deep, percussive, the kind of impact you feel in your own chest even when you're just watching. A sound like a drumstick hitting a side of beef, but sharper, more final. Stevenson's forward motion stopped instantly. Completely. He didn't stumble backward or bend over or show any of the normal reactions to a body shot. He just froze mid-step, his face draining of color under the harsh ring lights. The referee was watching closely, hands ready to intervene if necessary, but Stevenson was still standing, still technically in the fight. His mouth was open, working silently, trying to draw breath that wasn't coming easily. His eyes had gone wide, pupils dilated with shock and something approaching panic. Lee had stepped back to his original distance, hands down again, watching with that same patient intensity as before. I'd covered bare, knuckle fights in places where rules were treated as suggestions. I'd seen men hit with improvised weapons, watched street fighters throw punches that dropped opponents like sacks of cement. But I'd never seen a single strike change the entire atmosphere of a room the way that palm strike did. Because now everyone knew. Stevenson knew. His corner knew. The referee knew. The drunk guys in the cheap seats knew. Bruce Lee had been holding back. Everything that had happened before that moment, the evasion, the psychological pressure, the systematic dismantling of Stevenson's confidence, all of it had been testing, measuring, proving a point. That single strike was just a demonstration, a tiny glimpse of what would happen if Lee chose to actually fight rather than simply defend and counter. The round bell rang. Stevenson walked to his corner, but his walk was different now, mechanical, uncertain. His trainer grabbed him immediately, sat him down hard, started yelling instructions while waving smelling salts under his nose, trying to bring him back from wherever that palm strike had sent his consciousness. Bruce Lee sat calmly in his corner and didn't look at his trainer. He was staring across the ring at Stevenson with the same expression as before. Nothing had changed in his eyes. The killing intent was still there, patient and absolute, waiting for round 2. The inevitable conclusion. The 1-minute rest period felt like it lasted an hour. I watched Stevenson's chest heaving as he struggled to regulate his breathing. I watched his trainer's increasingly desperate attempts to rally him, to convince him that what had just happened was somehow survivable. I watched the confusion and genuine concern spreading across the faces of everyone in Stevenson's corner. And I watched Bruce Lee sit perfectly motionless, conserving energy, waiting with the patience of something that has already decided how this story ends and is simply allowing the necessary time to pass before the conclusion arrives. The 10-second warning sounded. Both fighters stood. Stevenson tried to look confident, rolling his shoulders, bouncing slightly on his toes, going through the familiar pre-round rituals, but it was hollow theater now. His eyes told a completely different story. The bell rang for round 2. This time, when Bruce Lee came out of his corner, his hands weren't at his sides anymore. They were up, positioned with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. The arena held its collective breath. What followed wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. It was a systematic demonstration of the difference between someone who understands violence as geometry and someone who only understands it as athletics. Stevenson came out cautious, guard tight, moving laterally instead of straight forward. His trainer had probably told him to box, to use his reach advantage, to keep Lee at the end of his jab and accumulate points. Sound strategy against most opponents. Lee walked straight at him. Not aggressive, not rushing, just walking forward with absolute commitment to the direction, like a man crossing a street who knows the traffic will stop for him. Every step Stevenson took to create space, Lee eliminated with better positioning. Every angle Stevenson tried to establish, Lee cut off with movements that seemed to anticipate Stevenson's intentions before Stevenson himself was fully aware of them. When Stevenson finally threw a jab to halt Lee's advance, Lee's left hand came up to redirect it, not to block, but to guide Stevenson's glove past his head with minimal effort. And in that microsecond, while Stevenson's lead hand was extended and his right was still chambered, Lee struck. A straight punch, right hand down the center line, hitting Stevenson's face before his jab had fully retracted. The speed wasn't superhuman, it was predictive. Lee had known where Stevenson's guard would be and had threaded a gap that didn't exist yet but would exist by the time his fist arrived. Stevenson's head snapped back. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just a sharp, precise movement that told everyone who understood fighting that the punch had landed clean and hard. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of Stevenson's mouth. The final humiliation, the crowd erupted at that first visible damage, that permission to release the tension that had been building for over 4 minutes of competition. But I wasn't watching the crowd. I was watching Bruce Lee's face. What I saw there was more frightening than any expression of rage could have been. Nothing had changed, no satisfaction, no excitement, no increase in intensity. The same fixed stare, the same terrible stillness beneath the movement. He'd hurt Stevenson and registered the information the way a scientist might note a gauge reading in an experiment. Data point received. Hypothesis confirmed. Proceeding to next phase. Stevenson tried to clinch a boxer's instinct when hurt. Get close, tie up the arms, buy time for the head to clear. Lee didn't let him. The moment Stevenson reached for him, Lee's hands were there, not grabbing but striking. Short punches to the ribs, elbows to the solar plexus, knees coming up when Stevenson bent forward from the body shots. The referee should have separated them, should have called for a break in the action. But this wasn't a clinch in the way boxing traditionally defines it. Lee wasn't holding or stalling, he was working, systematically dismantling Stevenson's structure at close range. When they finally separated, or rather, when Lee allowed separation by stepping back cleanly, Stevenson was breathing hard, his guard lowered from fatigue or pain or both. 40 seconds into the second round, and he already looked like he'd been fighting for an hour. Lee's breathing remained steady, controlled. He'd thrown perhaps 20 strikes and showed no sign of exertion whatsoever. What happened next would later be cited in medical journals as a textbook example of systematic trauma accumulation. Lee moved Stevenson methodically into the corner where the ropes met at 90 degrees and options disappeared. Every defensive move Stevenson made created an opening for the next attack. Every attempt to cover up exposed a different target. Left hand to the eyes, forcing Stevenson's guard up. Right hand to the exposed ribs. When the guard dropped to protect the body, another strike to the face. It was a conversation conducted entirely in violence, with Lee asking questions through his strikes and Stevenson's body providing answers that Lee used to formulate the next question. The referee finally stepped in, pushing between them, giving Stevenson a standing 8 count. It was technically within the rules, but everyone understood it for what it really was, a mercy intervention to prevent further systematic destruction. Stevenson nodded when asked if he could continue. His pride demanded it. But his eyes had changed, glazed, unfocused, the brightness replaced by the dull shine of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been violently readjusted. When they resumed, Lee didn't rush in for a finish. He maintained the same measured pressure, the same patient intensity. A kick to Stevenson's lead leg, precisely placed, degrading his mobility. Another kick to the same spot, then another. Each impact accumulating damage like compound interest. By the time Stevenson tried to throw his final desperate combination, a wild, looping hook powered by everything he had left, Lee was already inside the arc of the punch, too close for it to land with any power. He drove his shoulder into Stevenson's chest while simultaneously sweeping his legs, and Stevenson went down. Not knocked out, not technically knocked down, but simply deposited on the canvas like a piece of furniture being rearranged. Medical intervention. Stevenson got up quickly, trying to demonstrate that he wasn't seriously hurt, that it was just a slip, nothing more. But his corner was screaming at him now, and I could read lips well enough to understand they were telling him to survive, to protect himself, to make it to the bell. 40 seconds left in the round. An eternity. Lee came forward again, always forward, never retreating, maintaining that constant, inexorable pressure. When Stevenson threw a desperate jab, Lee walked through it, accepting the punch on his forehead where the skull is thickest, and a boxing glove does minimal damage. His counter went straight through Stevenson's guard and caught him flush on the cheek. Stevenson's legs wavered. For a moment, I thought he would fall completely, but he managed to grab Lee to tie him up, holding on with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. The referee moved in to break the clinch. And in that moment, with the official between them, with Stevenson's eyes showing white around the edges and blood running from multiple facial cuts, Bruce Lee did something I'll remember until the day I die. He smiled. Not a happy smile. Not cruel either. Something else entirely, the expression of someone who had proven a point and felt no need to drive it home any further. The smile of someone showing mercy by restraining themselves from demonstrating the full extent of their capabilities. The bell rang, ending the second round. Stevenson stumbled to his corner where his trainer immediately sat him down and began frantically working on the cuts, applying ice to control swelling that was already distorting the left side of his face. The ring doctor climbed through the ropes. I watched him examine Stevenson under the harsh overhead lights, tilting his head left and right, checking his eyes for signs of concussion, asking questions about his vision and balance. Stevenson answered as best he could, insisting through swollen lips that he could continue, that he was fine, that he just needed a minute to recover. The doctor stepped back and made a cutting motion with his hand. The referee immediately waved his arms, signaling the end of the contest. Technical knockout. Medical stoppage. Fight over. The crowd's roar turned confused, then angry. They'd paid to see a conclusion, not what felt like premature intervention. But those of us close enough to see Stevenson's condition understood the doctor's decision. One more round wouldn't just result in more damage, it would result in the kind of injury that doesn't heal completely. Bruce Lee stood in his corner, still expressionless. No celebration, no raised arms, no victory lap around the ring. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect directed toward no one in particular, and left the ring exactly as he'd entered it. Walking to work, walking home. The aftermath, I watched Stevenson's team help him through the ropes, supporting his weight as they guided him down the steps toward the dressing room area. He'd entered the ring as a professional boxer with an impressive record and legitimate aspirations. He was leaving as someone who'd learned that everything he thought he knew about fighting was dangerously incomplete. The crumpled Chinese flag was still on the canvas where it had fallen. Someone from the ring crew picked it up carefully, smoothed it out, and handed it to a member of Lee's departing entourage. I noticed they treated it with the reverence it should have received from the beginning. As the arena slowly emptied, I remained in my seat for a long time, staring at my notebook, trying to find adequate words for what I'd witnessed. I never did find them, not really. Some experiences exist beyond language, beyond the neat categories we use to make sense of organized violence. That night, I saw killing intent, not as metaphor, not as poetic exaggeration, but as an observable phenomenon. I watched a man step across a line that should never be crossed, watched him disrespect something sacred in front of someone who understood the true meaning of that disrespect. And I watched the inevitable consequence unfold with the terrible precision of natural law. Tommy Stevenson never fought professionally again. He retired from boxing 6 months later, citing recurring headaches and an inability to fully trust his reflexes. In interviews years afterward, he would describe that night as the moment he realized he'd been playing a children's game while his opponent was engaged in something far more serious. Bruce Lee continued fighting, continued demonstrating, continued developing what would eventually become his philosophy of martial arts as a way of understanding conflict at its most fundamental level. But I've always believed that something changed for him that night too. He'd been forced to show a part of himself that he preferred to keep hidden, forced to demonstrate capabilities that were meant for life or death situations, not sporting contests. The line between warrior and performer is thinner than most people realize. Once you've crossed it, once you've allowed that ancient part of yourself to surface in front of witnesses, you can never quite go back to pretending it doesn't exist. 5 seconds. That's all it took to end a professional boxer's career and reveal the difference between someone who fights for trophies and someone who fights because they understand that sometimes, in this world, fighting is the only language that carries sufficient weight. The Chinese flag incident became legend in martial arts circles, though the details were often distorted in the telling. What never changed was the lesson. Respect isn't optional, and some lines, once crossed, lead to consequences that no amount of athletic ability can prevent. 30 years later, I still think about that night whenever I cover a fight. I watch for the moment when competition becomes something else, when sport transforms into its older, darker ancestor. Most of the time, thankfully, that transformation never occurs. But when it does, when those ancient switches get thrown and civilized men remember what they're truly capable of, the results are unforgettable. And Tommy Stevenson learned that lesson in the most definitive way possible, 5 seconds at a time, until the doctors made it stop.